So for tonight's seam samples, we have two that we are going to do. We are going to do the flat felled seam and the turn and stitch seam. I have my stack of prepared 4" by 8" blocked rectangles here. I have a pin to help illustrate the right side versus the wrong side of the fabric, scissors, and my machine. So I'm ready to get started sewing. The first seam sample that we will do is the turn and stitch. So I'm going to take two 4" by 8" rectangles, go ahead and turn my machine on, and I'm going to sew this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So putting my right sides together, 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's a typical straight seam. I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end of my stitch line. Straight seam will look like this. I've already done my cooking show pre-prepared seam sample or ironing, so I'm going to pull out the next step. So from my straight seam, I'm going to press it completely open on that stitch line, being really careful on both sides of the fabric so that it's perfectly clean. There's no overlap or lip hanging over on either side. Then I'm going to take my seam allowance and carefully fold it in at 1/4 inch so that the raw edge touches that stitch line, and press it so that it looks like this. Be careful not to burn yourself because we are working with a really tiny 1/4 inch seam allowance at that point, and you'll do the same thing to the other side. So you'll open up that seam allowance, fold it inward, and iron it down at 1/4 inch on both sides so that it looks just like this. So I have my pre-pressed sample here that I'm going to continue sewing on. My cat is making an appearance. So it's called the turn and stitch for a reason, so I've already done the turn. Now I'm simply going to stitch just the seam allowance. So I'm going to fold the body of my fabric out of my way, and I'm going to create a stitch line at the edge of that fold, and that's going to perfectly capture my seam allowance in place. What that does is it prevents my fabric from fraying past that fold line. So this is a raw edge here. My fabric cannot fray past this new stitch line, so it really protects the integrity of the seam. It's not my favorite garment finish, but it is useful if you are not doing a lining. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch and backstitch at the beginning and end. If you're doing some like home sewing projects and don't own a serger or don't want to do a French seam, it's a great alternative for that. It also can be very decorative if you think about using some contrasting thread like I am. So I'm going really, really slowly because I really am trying to stitch right next to that fold line. And I'm back stitching at the end, so slowing down as I approach. So one side is done, so you can see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the other side, so I'm folding the material completely out of my way, so it's just this seam allowance I'm sewing, just at the edge. So now that I'm finished sewing, I'll open it up and my seam sample will look like this. So my seam allowance is perfectly secured by these stitch lines. It cannot fray past that stitch line, so the integrity of my seam is totally locked in. It is a nice finish, so if theoretically it were in a garment, these edges would be enclosed. It'll be pressed and lay really flat from the outside. It looks like this. So it can be a nice, like, you know, kind of top stitching detailing on the inside of a garment. I don't love it because I think you still see some of those frayed edges, so it definitely has a place. It was absolutely more common in vintage garment construction. It's not as popular now, just with, you know, modern serging and overlock techniques. So I'm going to move on from the turn and stitch, still very useful, to talking about our flat felled seam. Sorry, my cat is sitting right behind me in the same chair. There's no personal space in this home. You have to go. Go. You have to go. Okay. So, the flat felled seam, I am going to draw the face of my fabric. So, our beautiful floral print is back. The flat felled seam is done by stitching the wrong sides together, so having the seam allowance on the outer of our piece of fabric. You'll see the flat felled seam very commonly in denim garments, so you'll see it on the inside of jeans or shoulders of jean jackets. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch my wrong sides together with my right sides out at a 1/2 inch. I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end of this seam sample. Okay, so when I open it up, it'll look like this. My seam allowance will be completely on the wrong side, okay? I'll see the right side of my fabric with that seam exposed. The wrong side of my fabric looks like this. It looks like a clean seam, okay? So I, again, have my pre-prepared sample ready. I'm gonna draw on my floral print for some clarity. Okay, so it'll look like this. I have gone ahead and ironed this already. Similar to our turn and stitch seam, all of these seams kind of build on one another. I have folded over the edge of my seam allowance at 1/4 inch, so it's touching that stitch line. The other side I have not done anything to. This side is going to be trimmed away. So it should look like this. Sorry, I had a thread snag there, but never mind. It should look like this. What my next step is going to be is trimming this down. So this should be folded at 1/4 inch. So that 1/2 inch total is at 1/4. I'm going to trim this down to 1/8 because this seam is going to cover it and I do not want to see any of this poking through. So I'm going to fold it out of my way so I can cleanly trim. And really I'm trimming this down to 1/8 inch. That's also going to take away from the bulk of the seam. If I left it at 1/4 inch, it would make for a really, really thick intersection anywhere this is attached to something. So we want to get rid of some of that. It would also create a lot of structure, you know, of pretty rigid garment. So that seam that is going to be covered is trimmed away, and now I'll fold this over and I'm ready to stitch at the edge all the way down. Again, you've definitely seen this seam technique used in the inseam of jeans, in jean jackets. It's very common. I love this technique because it is super secure. So it's very much like a French seam where there's no raw edge anymore. It's completely encapsulated. This will never fall apart. It's one of the most secure machine finishes. It's really beautiful. It's great on straight seams or things with minimal curve. Okay, so I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end, And I want to make sure that my stitch line is really, really close to that edge to make it uniform and clean. On my machine, I'm lining up the edge with the inner prong. All machine feet are a little bit different, but I am visually finding a space and keeping my stitch line level with that space. So this should produce a really nice, clean seam finish. Okay, stitching and back stitching. So when I remove my seam sample, this looks great. So on the face of my fabric, I'll have my print, I'll have this beautiful double row of stitch line. On the inside, I'll have a singular stitch line, okay? And that's just really clean. It's perfectly encapsulated. As I mentioned, it does give a bit of structure to the piece. So this is a really nice way of maybe creating some body and garment without using boning or interfacing. It's a nice way to utilize a seam for construction. Okay, so that's our turn and stitch seam and our flat felled seam for this evening.